gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Kalpana Ram to our seminar series today. Dr. Ram is an Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at Macquarie University in Sydney. Her work brings together detailed fieldwork in India, especially in the south of India, and issues of theory focusing on questions such as class, gender, women's movements in India, caste and popular religion. And that's also reflected in her teaching, which covers topics of gender, India, phenomenology and the body. Dr. Ram's published widely, including her second monograph entitled Fertile Disorder, Spirit Possession and Modern Projects of Subjectivity in the Lives of Rural Tamil Women. And that's published by the University of Hawaii Press. It's a blend of descriptive ethnography of women's lives and larger theoretical and political questions. And it re-examines various projects of modernisation and attempt to reshape rural women's subjectivities and their bodies. She's recently published on activism and modernity amongst Dalit women, as well as on Tamil religious cinema, the marginalisation of certain forms of ritual dance, and the construction of Indian nationalism, and has her most recent publication is an edited volume called Phenomenology and Anthropology, which was published by Indiana University Press last year. In 2011, a series of papers in journals such as South Asia, Asian Studies Review, South Asian History, as well as several edited collections, all dealt with in various ways the politics of knowledge in midwifery and childbirth, the instability between scientific and older ethical discourses, and what it means to know one's body. A number of more recent publications also reflect a fresh research commitment to integrating emotion and affect into our understanding of politics and social lives, both in aesthetic traditions as well as in the most rationalist of ventures. As I said, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ram to speak to us today on the topic of Mutamma, Tamil Dalit spirit healer, and community leader, provocation to our received understandings of agency. So if you'd like to join me in giving Dr. Ram a right round.
Thank you, Matt. And it's been a great pleasure to speak here. I've just been hearing on lunch about how this was actually started back in 1972 as a seminar series, and it's never missed a beat. And I think that's just a thrill, to be. Sorry?
You should be louder, please.
Louder?
Yeah.
Okay. Usually people hear me quite well. So it's been going for such a one, and I mean that's really early days in terms of women's struggles within the academy, and it gives me enormous pleasure, therefore, to actually step into such a wonderful tradition. The book that Matt mentioned is being retitled a bit. Sorry, that's my mistake. I should go and update that website. But it is called Fertile Disorder, but it's called Spirit Possession and it's Provocation of the Modern. So it's got a better subtitle than I had originally thought about. So today, this is a series on women and leadership, and gender and leadership. And I'm sort of using the material from my book to sort of think about the question that we've been asked to address in this series. And so I want to begin, therefore, it sort of takes the form, the talk takes the form of starting with a bit of a meditation about the kinds of deep-seated antinomies and binarisms that we've inherited with political traditions, the traditions of political thinking. And then it goes into a kind of ethnography or descriptive kind of account of a particular woman called Mutamma, who is a spirit healer as well as an NGO leader. So she's both. And it's really that kind of case study that as a phenomenologist, I'm also interested in getting us to think about what phenomenologists call limit cases or limit instances, which really put our own assumptions into question and then force us to really expand our imagination in order to think about it and to question our own presuppositions. So that's the rough structure of the talk. So let's begin then by thinking about these deep-seated oppositions, part of long-standing Western political traditions, both liberalism and socialism, which have informed appraisals of power and politics in non-Western societies. So I'm interested in how they actually travel. And I'm beginning with these two traditions because so many of the debates around women's unfreedom, particularly in non-Western cultures, and as well as what we mean by leadership as a narrower subset of that, have been shaped by these traditions. Particularly which kinds of leadership we find meaningful and worthy of approbation. Liberalism and socialism are, of course, only part of political inheritance. So much of the appraisal of women's unfreedom, whether it's the hijab or the veil, or seclusion more generally, or issues such as maternal mortality, has been shaped by concerns and politics of colonial power. And this is something I've been writing about off and on since the 1990s, when I helped to set up the Gender Relations Centre at the Australian National University. And I began to write about colonial legacies in areas such as maternity and birth, which had a very ready recourse to finding fault with the culture, finding fault with dirty midwives, finding fault with seclusion as being unhygienic. But today I'm shifting the focus to think more about political traditions that we would consider worthy, ones which actually have set out to challenge colonialism, what we would consider progressive political traditions, such as socialism and feminism itself. And it's these traditions that have given us very dominant motifs and tropes of emancipation, of emancipatory forms of struggle, and of course very central to setting up of women's studies programs. And I want to focus on the way in which these progressive traditions, with their central drive to empower the oppressed, the marginalized, the exploited, have also transmitted to us not just discursive categories, because all traditions do that, they transmit discursive categories, but it's what I want to focus on is the very oppositional categories which pit things against one another, things which are actually part of a continuum of human experience. And I want us to think also about the way in which these traditions have shaped intellectual life in non-Western countries, and I'm here thinking particularly of India. And I'll start off with an example of how it has shaped debates within India. And I will take what I would think of as one of the most imaginative attempts to reappraise Indian political life, and particularly histories of resistance and rebellion by oppressed classes. And this was the rise of something called subaltern studies, which began in the 80s. And it started with Ranjit Guha and his School of Historiography. And what I want to look at is, again, a limit case. So religion keeps appearing as a kind of limit case for this attempt to rethink peasant politics, peasant rebellions, resistance. And I'll just take one example because that's all the time we will have, but it's the first book that came out of Ranjit Guha's, which is called Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency. It's a very imaginative rereading of colonial archives. It tries to reinterpret peasant movements in the colonial period, and it actually tries to rethink religion. It takes as its very explicit goal, and so do many of the others in that series of subaltern studies, the goal of reinterpreting what it means that so much of peasant consciousness had a religious character to it. But even as Guha strains to reintegrate religion as something which is lying outside the framework of modern historiography, the tradition of politics that he's working with, which is a socialist one, makes it virtually impossible for him to perform this task. And Ranjit Guha took very heavily from the Italian Marxist Gramsci, and he describes peasant religious consciousness in terms that are typically Gramscian, and I quote, as a hesitant, inchoate, disjointed perception, which cannot but clothe itself, borrow from the received language of the ruling class. So in other words, peasant consciousness cannot express itself properly as long as it keeps clothing itself in these inherited traditions of the ruling class, which are religious ones. Such a consciousness, in his words, falls far short of conceptualizing the structure of authority which made such conditions possible. In other words, and you get this in Bourdieu as well, it cannot provide the kind of knowledge of where our oppression is really coming from. It cannot deliver the kind of knowledge of not just of how our experience is shaped, but what are the preconditions of that experience. Now, I'm not going to say that this kind of knowledge was present in peasant rebellions, or that every subordinate group has immediate access to such knowledge, but I would say actually that it's doubtful that any intellectual tradition or framework could deliver this kind of full knowledge, which is an enlightenment kind of goal in a way, of delivering complete knowledge to full consciousness. But what is also very much the point here is that it is religious consciousness of this peasant leader, which is being singled out for this kind of scrutiny, critical scrutiny. And what he calls, the way he describes this religious consciousness is as inheriting and uncritically absorbing the material of the ruling culture, and thus eroding the radical potential of this rebellion. So, the way we think about the political subject of rebellion and resistance is, I think, very closely linked up with this kind of description. And particularly it comes down to the way we conceive of agency. So in Guha's assessment, the peasant leader who led this anti-colonial rebellion was deprived of the means of seeing agency as something that resided within himself. So again, it's not just full consciousness and awareness of knowledge about where our oppression comes from, but we should be able, in this view, to recognize all of our agency as residing within ourselves when we are true leaders. This peasant leader is unable to conceive of himself as an autonomous political subject. Instead, and I'm quoting here again, he is still committed to envisaging the coming war on the British Raj as the project of a will independent of himself and his own role in it as no more than instrumental. So this is where he falls short. He's simply an instrument of God, and in fact, when the peasant leader, the archives, the colonial archives have the words of the peasant leader who says, it is not we who are fighting, it is God that Thakur is master. It is God the master who is fighting. But in the hands of a modern critic like Guha, who is trying to be most sympathetic, this statement of the peasant leader gets glossed as, and I quote, the authors did not even recognize their own voice, but heard only that of God. So where we should be hearing our own voices, we mistakenly hear that of God. Where we should be recognizing all of agency as residing within ourselves, we mistakenly think it's coming from somewhere else. Now, I just want to bring to our attention then the enormous number of contrasts and polarities that actually are structuring this discourse. On the one hand, we've got that which is inherited uncritically, tradition. On this side, we've got agency as that which is newly generated. On this side, we've got uncritically absorbed attitudes. On this side, we've got conscious, systematic critique. On this side, we've got agency that we see as coming from others to us. And on this side, we've got agency claimed as entirely residing within ourselves. And we could also say consciousness on this side and a lack of full awareness on this side. So in each case, of course, religion is firmly placed on the left-hand side, my left-hand side, as all those sets of terms I've described are structuring what we think of as religion. And then it's barred from playing a part in what we might call progressive politics, progressive forms of political leadership. Religion and religious consciousness gets systematically placed in the sphere of the traditional, the passively accepted, and ultimately must be regarded as a disavowal of what is really an entirely, purely human agency. And you can see all sorts of traditions coming in through here. And that's actually part of the paradox, that in these characterizations, it is, tradition is actually flowing through these characterizations themselves. And in many ways, these characterizations are themselves reproducing uncritically traditions that they have absorbed. And yet, the whole critique is based on this idea that we should be completely aware and critically rejecting the role played by an inherited tradition. So even the critique itself is, in other words, eroded from within, if you want, by the degree to which traditions are shaping it. And that's again not a critique that I would say is, I'm just putting that critique in terms of the discourse itself, but I would say that all of us are shaped by traditions that we can't be fully aware of. That's my position. And so the traditions that are flowing through here are partly those of modern, liberalism, socialism, etc. But I also think that there are deeper traditions at work in such characterizations of agency which go behind or beyond modernity. I'm thinking here of epic and mythic traditions, where the hero is someone who is conquering obstacles that are external to himself, establishing himself as a triumphant individual subject in doing so. And I'm not using the male pronoun by chance here. These are deeply gendered mythic traditions. And I remember, when I was a young feminist reading Teresa de Loretis's work on the narrative structure of European mythic texts. And she talks about the way in which mythic stories are morphologically gendered. So, for example, if you have oppositions between the mobile hero who's traveling and the obstacle that has to be overcome. And the obstacle could be the Sphinx, the dragon, the sorceress, the villain. But what she's saying is that in all of these cases, the obstacle is morphologically female, and this mythic hero is morphologically male. So viewed in terms of one of these, viewed in these terms, one of the dominant conceptualizations of agency that we have inherited is itself, to some extent, morphologically masculine. I want to hasten to say this does not mean that women may not exercise or benefit from just such forms of agency. There's no form of agency that I'm describing here that I want to rule out as somehow unsuitable for women or not important to women. What I am saying, though, is that dominant conceptions of agency are themselves not gender neutral, and at the very least, we need expanded understandings of agency to serve the full variety of female experience, which of course is to say human experience. Now, as an anthropologist, I work very much in terms of ethnographic experience, so I'm going to introduce here the kind of challenge that Mutamma, the spirit healer, poses to our received notions of political agency and leadership. She was someone I met in South India, in Tamil Nadu, while I was doing my fieldwork. She was from an agricultural Dalit community in Chengalpet district, for those who know South India or Tamil Nadu. And she was introduced to me as the Talbot, or the head of her village branch of what is called the Mother Sangam, or the Mothers Union. And the organization that she was part of was known as the Rural Education and Animation Center. And this organization was focusing on a whole range of Dalit women's issues, which included health issues, such as obtaining basic facilities, health facilities for the village, but also at that time, this was in 2001 or 2, there was new legislation had been coming through the late 90s onwards for reserving seats for women in the local government institutions, which are called panchayats. Mutamma immediately stood out by her striking presence. That she had this enormous red potu on the vermilion mark on her forehead, as well as sacred ash that was smeared across her broad forehead. She wore her hair in an unusually large knot, and this tall woman with a ramrod posture, straight back, shaped by years of rice cultivation. She could glide into the room and stand there quite noiselessly, much to the discomfiture of some of my better educated companions. There was something very different about this leader of the Mothers Union, and I immediately, had all my antennae out. I'd already been working on spirit possession, and I got to know her better in the weeks to come. The story she told me about how she became a spirit medium is what I'm going to dwell on for a little while. It was a story that fits in with the kind of narratives that female spirit mediums generally told me. It was one where they did not inherit their power from a teacher or there was no formal tutelage. Typically, women gained their power not through a kind of a formal program of training that brings them into forms of cultural capital, rather what I would describe as learning from the school of hard knocks, to use an English phrase. Through suffering. That's how she, and coming through suffering. And she did eventually overcome that suffering to some extent. But what I'm going to try and describe is how that agency isn't just a matter of heroically overcoming obstacles. From the beginning, her story is marked by the presence of the goddess. In her very early childhood, a very critical illness made her almost die. And she was reborn only through the grace of the goddess. And this is how she told me this. At 3, she says, I was given up for dead, and they'd already prepared my coffin. It was a special coffin made for a child, shaped like a cradle, covered with a yellow cloth. I was in a coma, I hadn't eaten for days, I was considered dead. Then a deity spoke through my father. Her father did have some gifts, by the way, also in this direction. The deity said, give my name to her and I will come on her. Make 2 eyes of silver and I will open her eyes. And this is a very common thing you find in many cultures where you get a sort of a replica of the organ or the limb that has become diseased and that's made out of something precious and given to the deity as a form of votive offering. So this deity actually says, make these eyes and I'll open her eyes. So these eyes were made in silver and given to the koil of the temple. My eyes opened and I lived. And so I got this name, Mutamma. This was a new name. Until then I'd been called Kanakanda, she says. So her name was changed. Now, even after this, though, as she was growing up, Mutamma experienced kind of ongoing dizzy or giddy spells. And this would come on her, particularly when she heard the sounds of the drums that were often associated with ritual worship of the goddess. And this happened right up to the age of 10. By this time, I mean, she was only a little older than this, about 12, when she was married off. So she talks about this because she remained unreconciled to her marriage for quite some time. And she did that with characteristic zeal as well, resisting her husband. So she says, I was only 12 when I was married, and here in this part of the world, amongst Dalit, particularly the kinship system allows close kin to be married. So, you know, cross-cousin marriage, as well as mother's brothers also can be married to their nieces. So she was married to her father's sister's son. I was only 12 when I married my Uttapille. He had lived with us already for a few years, so I knew him very well. But I knew nothing of the fact that I was going to get married. I kept wondering, why were they preparing this feast? Why were they taking me to town? I just kept running away from him. When it was time to be with him, that is sexually, she says, I tied my sari to my auntie, because that was her husband's mother after all. I tied my sari to my auntie to know that she was still going to be with me. But while I slept, my auntie untied the knot and she sneaked away. I rejected him, and my husband went out with his friends. His friends said to him, go home and don't take no for an answer. When he returned, he saw me asleep in his mother's arms. He tried to take my arm, but I rejected him, and I just kept on rejecting him. Finally, he was so dejected that he went off to hang himself. And eventually, they tied a charm with a mantra said over it, a Talbot, over my wrist, and to my pali, her wedding necklace, to change my feelings about him. Well, somehow, over the years, we got by, she says. At this point in her life, Mutamma began to experience a series of disasters. In retrospect, she interprets them as forms of sorcery. So these trials she doesn't necessarily see as all sent by the goddess, but she had another trouble, which was that her husband's cousin used to keep making sexual advances to her, and she kept rejecting him as well. So she says, after marriage, I was the victim of sunyam, or sorcery. My husband's cousin kept calling me. I was a good-looking woman, she says. When I walked fine and strong, and I wore a full set of jewels in those days. So women have to sell off their jewelry as they get, to meet all the adversities of poverty. So that she's saying at that time she had a full set. And because I rejected him, this man said, what I cannot have will not survive. And he kept sorcery on me. And then her children also, Mutamma's children also kept adding to her story. They were all sitting around while Mutamma told her life story. And so her daughter also talks about the sexual harassment of the mother. And but she also talks about envy of her mother. And she talks about how her mother began getting sick and her children began dying. And she says, my brother, who had already done his SSLC, that means she's trying to indicate how old her brother was, he died. So in fact, one of Mutamma's children's sons dies. My mother kept having continual periods, so she starts having these gynecological problems. She began to behave like an insane person. She even put a rope around her neck to hang herself. And then Mutamma goes on to talk about how many of her children actually began to suffer illnesses. 3 of her children died. Quite a huge thing. And so a 15-year-old son gets poisonous tumor, a daughter of 3 gets whooping cough, and then she says another son just died because his time had come. That was his fate. And then her husband's brother also became sick and so on. So all this suffering just comes in this waves, as it were. And this is very typical of suffering that we're talking about. It comes in varied forms, and it comes in, in these. It's affliction, like the biblical afflictions that just, pestilences that come. And it's this kind of context that makes people suspect sorcery, not just a singular event of illness for which they can find other meanings and other ideologies. But in the midst of all this suffering, and nobody knows why there's all this suffering, the goddess comes to Mutamma. And she has a dream in which there's a resplendent vision of the goddess with all her insignia. And the insignia are very powerful. So she has, the goddess has in her hand a fire pot, fire, a knife, as well as the trishulam, which is a trident, which is a very central insignia of the goddess. At this time of trouble, she says, I had this dream when Mutamma comes to me with all her Agni and her trishulam and her katti, and she came to give me Shakti. Shakti is probably a word that probably you're not familiar with, but it's more than just power. It's uniquely female as well, although men can also tap into it, but it's female energy. And it's something that women are supposed to have uniquely embodied in them, particularly in the south of India, but all over India. And so there are many rituals which try to sort of propitiate women for their Shakti and try and channel it into purposes of clan and kinship, which are ultimately male-dominated. So you can talk about, how Shakti flows into male-dominated environments as well. But this appearance of the goddess, the appearance of this goddess had such ritual power for Mutamma that even when she was telling me the story, it was enough to sort of send her into a kind of trance. Because by this time she's an established spirit medium, she's very practiced at it, and the telling of the story of the coming of the goddess is itself a ritual, has ritual power. And that's very common in South India, that the telling of a ritually charged story is itself a ritual performance. So as I watched, Mutamma went into a kind of flipped over into this other state. She yelled, she gritted her teeth, she was somewhere else, and it was her son who brought her back, as it were, to us. And he usually assisted her during her trance sessions when she had consultations with her clients. And he brought out all these sacred objects to bring her back. And it was only then that she could resume her story. I think I'll probably have to speed up a bit here and just say that one of the really interesting things is that eventually, this is how she becomes, so the goddess basically says, I'm giving you Shakti, and she starts to become a diviner. But eventually, she's still having all these gynecological problems, a lot of overbleeding. She actually needs a hysterectomy. But then the goddess comes in a vision, and she says, I'm going to punish the man who has set this sorcery on you, which is her husband's cousin. And the Mutamma simply says she chased him and she stuck her sulam, the trident, in the mud in front of him. Perhaps he had this vision. And he was brought low after that, and he begged my forgiveness publicly, and I and my children have been safe ever since then. Now, it should be noted that this kind of narrative about the vengeance, the terrible justice and setting right of injustices by the goddess is the stuff of popular cinema as well, all over the South, and as well as in the North, but it's very strong in the South. And the plot narratives of these are often about the harassment and tribulations of women that the goddess responds to with terrible vengeance exacted on the man who's been, or even the in-laws who've been doing this to the woman. So this is the story of how she becomes a spirit medium. She's a leader. If if you like, and she dispenses justice. When people come to see her, what she's doing is holding court. It's a court. She's not a healer in the conventional sense. It's more like a court of a sovereign being. But of course, her entire performance and agency is not that of Mutamma herself. It is that of bringing this goddess into presence, making her available for everyone who's gathered, making the goddess available in a sheer sensory form. And people who come to see her, men and women, but there are a lot of women, are themselves coming with just the sorts of complaints that Mutamma herself has been through in her life. So just as the goddess brought justice to Mutamma by, stopping the sorcery and bringing her Shakti, Mutamma now in her turn is bringing the goddess to other people, making her visible, not in the form of a dream, but actually enacting the goddess. So when Mutamma goes into these states, she actually speaks as the goddess. Her language changes. I don't even know where she got this language from because it's extraordinarily elevated Tamil. It's not the Tamil of a Dalit woman at all. And she stops being a Dalit woman, basically. She becomes, she never comes across as anything but incredibly strong and dignified. But as the goddess, she has left all traces of marginality and her stigmatized status in that society, and she's the most imperious, majestic goddess you could imagine. And she speaks in this elevated language, she performs it, she addresses people imperiously, she tells them very didactically what their problems are. She tells them, just as the goddess told her, she just tells them that things will be fixed up, that the wrongdoer will be brought to their knees, and that and the kinds of problems that women are coming to her with are often things where relationships have gone wrong. They're not simple things to do with, not simple things. They're not economic wars, they're not about there are a variety of things. Some of them might be about, sick livestock and lost objects and runaway, but a lot of them are about relationships. Sons who want to support a woman when she is old, husbands who have deserted the woman, taken another lover perhaps, laments about being abandoned, in a sense, about desertion and abandonment, as well as gynecological problems which won't stop, infertility, miscarriages, that kind. This is the sort of a big chunk of a very large chunk of the problems that women bring. So, in a way, what the women are complaining about is that somebody who should have cared for them no longer does. Somebody who should be taking care of them won't do it. And there's a sense of a bargain that has been, ethical bargain, that has been broken and violated. So the women have done the right thing, they have nurtured their sons, they have suckled them when they were babies and so on, but now, and they have given their husbands love and devotion or at least done everything that a wife should do, and now these men who should be looking after them no longer do, and then of course, the kind of destitution and abandonment, but it's not just poverty, it's also a broken heart that they're coming to. And the way that Mutamma provides justice to them is by the goddess actually telling everybody who has gathered what is going on in this woman's life. So there's a kind of performance of suffering, which is told in this very grand, authoritative way. This is what is happening with you. This is what you're feeling. Your belly is now on fire because no one cares about you. And the women who hear their own problems sort of amplified in this way and told in this way, they're often weeping to even hear this. But it's also the weeping of being recognized by someone who is in authority, who is the most supreme authority of all, namely the goddess. But also coming from her, it then allows everybody who has gathered there to actually constitute a kind of witnessing of this woman who nobody cares about till now, but now she matters. In this little environment, here, today, now, she matters. The goddess hears her, and everybody is hearing what the goddess is now saying about her, about the suffering woman. So, so in being subjected to the power of the goddess, the people who are coming to her, the women, are being reconstituted as subjects whose mattering, that the fact that they matter, makes their suffering something that can be alleviated, but also it establishes that there is something very unfair about what is happening to them. It establishes that this is injustice. And this way of being addressed is also crucial to the way justice is being dispensed. So, Mutamma's agency is obviously a very difficult one for us to then try and analyze. If there's an agent who is recognizably at work here, it is the goddess who is the agent, not Mutamma. Yet, Mutamma's own transition from suffering to mediumship illustrates a more complex form of agency at work. So as I said earlier, the kind of gendered narrative about the heroic overcoming of obstacles isn't quite right for describing what Mutamma has gone through and the way she tells about it herself. It's not that kind of heroic form of agency. She certainly goes through suffering, which Obeyesekara, another anthropologist who also writes about spirit mediums in Sri Lanka, describes as the dark night of the soul. But Obeyesekara describes this as a sort of heroic transcendence of obstacles. Whereas what I would suggest is that the success of these women depends not so much on overcoming obstacles and penetrating the obstacles, but rather in a very slow temporality of practice, which Tamils call parakam. Parakam means habituation, and it's something that Tamils use as a way of describing even what, say for example, the way Mutamma and her husband eventually get by over time, and a lot of marriage actually, and the success of a lot of marriage is described by Tamils as parakam, which is a kind of habituation to one another. But it's more than just getting by. I mean, parakam also means somebody that wasn't part of you to begin with becomes a part of you. And when they go, you miss them. You know, you become intertwined. And so parakam has affective qualities to it, embodied affective, intercorporeal affective dimensions to it, strongly affective dimensions to it. So in this case, Mutamma has made room for a being who initially was outside of herself, but over time she's incorporated her into her own way of being. And I'm talking about the goddess herself. So agency, Mutamma's agency is neither just the goddess and neither is it just herself. Rather, it's been a case of making room for an initially alien other. And her success is measured not by vanquishing obstacles alone, but by being able to allow this initially alien outside force to communicate through her its power and presence to everyone who's gathered. So what I'm trying to get at is that I don't want to sort of replace this with another polarity between Western conceptions of agency and non-Western conceptions of agency. The medium is not the classic subject of Western ideas of agency. If Mutamma was just Mutamma all the way through, she was just the same recognizable subject all the way through, then she wouldn't be a medium. I mean, and there would be no difference between who she was before she became a medium and who she is now. But at the same time, it's not just a flipping over of this coin. So she's not just evacuating herself when she's being the medium. You know, she's there as well. And so I've been trying to think of how to think about this. So it's like there's a porous membrane between her and the goddess on this side, and also between her and her audience. She's communicating all the time with her audience. And also there's another membrane somewhere else as well between the past and the present. So she remembers what these people have said before, but she also remembers the typical kinds of problems that men and women are liable to come to her with. So there's a repertoire, in other words, and there's a history that she's building up all the the time about how to be more and more effective as a skilled medium. So there's skill building going on. There's memory involved. But it's not the classic version of memory where we simply have access to everything in a fully conscious kind of way. Well, that's not our understanding of memory anyway. I mean, we talk about all kinds of memory, including involuntary memory and so on. So this new version of agency that I'm trying to talk about has to place time at the very core. It's over time that this form of agency develops. And it's only over time that this woman is attuning herself both to spirits and deities as well as to her clients. And of course the fact that she has been through the suffering herself is actually a very important aspect of time as well. I mean, her own journey through the suffering, which she's then redeploying in this new form. So this kind of accommodation I'm talking about is very different from the agency that we often focus on. Again, not to rule out those forms of agency, but agency as choice, for example. There's nothing, this woman has not chosen her path in the classic sense. In fact, she's been called to it. But neither is it the opposite of choice. It's not acquiescence either. She's not just doing the bidding of the spirit. Rather, it's a kind of slow, processual kind of accommodation. So let me say a little bit now about her role as the leader of the Mothers' Union. The way in which Mutamma exercises skilled performativity as a medium struck me as not very different from the way that she leads the Mothers' Union. And I'll talk about two continuities here. One was her style of rhetorical performativity, the skill, the eloquence, which she shows as a medium, is also there in the way she talks about her journey into the figure of somebody we will recognize more readily, which is an NGO village leader. And here she borrows very, very heavily from an authoritative discourse that's given to her, which is this woman called Lourdes, an educated woman who came and was recruiting women to become local level leaders. When she tells me the story of how she became an NGO leader, she talks about Lourdes and she uses the language of Lourdes, but she also, again, as with her story of how she became a medium, she foregrounds the story of suffering as a key to everything. So this is how she tells that story. Lourdes, the recruiting woman, she called us to organize, and she told us, these politicians, they line their pockets. Let us ask for a road, let us ask for current. Current is electricity. Because out of the 4 and 5 rupees that we earn as coolies, we have to see to our children's education. We have to buy and cook our food out of that money. We work all day. We can ask for greater wages. Since we began to organize, we now have a hand pump set for water. We went to the current office, electricity office, and we said, we want a patta, we want a title for our land, we want a water pipe for our street. Our wisdom was born. It grew. We have not allowed the sale of liquor in our village for 3 years now. There's been a lot of struggle around alcohol sale because governments also have vested interest in excise duty and alcohol is often sort of subtly promoted in villages. The vote buyer, she calls politicians vote buyers. The vote buyer sits in great comfort and he goes to America, he goes to London, he roams the world. We still have our paraya, our later servitude. So I ask this, you say you will give us loans and you take our signature, but my child is still in rags. That loan has gone elsewhere. My being a Talbot ahead has brought us nothing. It has brought me nothing to feed my child with. Other leaders, they get fat, they wear their kumkum, they wear their turmeric. We have sent a petition to Dalit, who's the state chief minister, and we ask her, why do you keep raising the price of food, of fertilizers? We ask her, how can we survive? You and your ministers, they just squat around the place. End of quote. So in both cases, there's this, very lively, dramatic sort of foregrounding of suffering, and whether it's secular or sacred, there's a commonality there. But there are also commonalities in how justice is sought. So, although women do take the language of NGOs and they frame it, their suffering and so on in those terms to some extent, but the kind of modality I was talking about earlier, where Mutamma is representing the voice of the most hierarchically elevated being you can imagine. She doesn't just represent it, she becomes it. And then the people who come to her for relief are finding relief because this most incredibly exalted, powerful being hears them and is responding to their suffering. And being heard by that being is itself already performatively bringing justice into action, into existence. Now that modality can also be seen in seemingly secular contexts as well. So I'll just finish then with a story which is told in another ethnography by Cody, which is again in rural Tamil Nadu, where literacy activists were trying to bring adult Dalit women to the point where they could write. And they saw writing as the means of becoming effective citizens. And they wanted these women to demonstrate their effective citizenship by going to the district collector and presenting the collector with a petition. The women were not that interested in demanding what the organizer wanted them to demand, which was title to the land. And again, for the organizers, it was this land title, like the writing, that was supposed to be a mark of effective citizenship. But the women weren't that fussed about this land title, but they did think of something that they were concerned about, and that was that they had always gone down a particular route to cremate their dead. And now the upper castes had taken over that bit of land and weren't letting them go through the fields anymore. So they said, okay, we'll tell this to the district collector to allow us to have our access. So they took a whole day off from agricultural labor, but they didn't just go to the collector. They put on their best clothes, they put on flowers in their hair, and they went all the way there, but the collector was not there and he was gone for the day. And there was no time left to write out the whole petition themselves. They left behind something that had already been written by the activist. But the women wanted to sign it, and they wanted to call the collector their dharmic master, that is to say, someone who understands the codes of dharma, of ethics, and understands that it's his duty to look after them as someone who is hierarchically elevated. The organizers said, this is not the right, no, you shouldn't be signing it like this, because it didn't fit in with his modern egalitarian sensibility. And the women had not just said, called him a dharmic master, but they had also pleaded for compassion. Please look after us. Whereas the NGO organizer thought this was retrograde. So the plea for compassion was removed. So I'll finish by quoting from Cody. He says, for the women who had come to the office that day, my sense is that they would have only been satisfied that they had performed the act of petitioning if they had been able to see the collector and plead with him using generic conventions, compelling superiors to act on behalf of the weak. Their ambivalence was a product of having been denied the chance to make an affective claim through eye contact, ensuring that the collector would feel with their suffering. End of quote. So again, it's actually not so removed from the court of the goddess. Again, what these women wanted was to have this embodied connection with the superior and to feel and to be able to tell their story in such a moving way that that person would be moved and feel their suffering. And this is something that is also very intimately tied to other forms of performance that the women are very good at, like the lament. The lament is a powerful mode through which women prize the ability to make that superior melt. And they count their success by bringing tears to the eyes and the ear, to the person who's listening to it. And in fact, when I asked women to tell the story of their lives, they would tell that story very much in this form again, because I was that superior in this context, and they wanted me to weep for them. So, in this realm of performativity and performance, we see the centrality of establishing intersubjective forms of recognition in which hierarchy is being mobilized rather than being overturned or let alone denied. So again, I think this is another sort of dichotomy we have to think of, which prevents us from recognizing agency and leadership in a continuum, not only between the sacred and the secular, which I've talked about here, but between hierarchy and egalitarianism. Needless to say, my purpose here is not to replace one with the other, but to recognize the continuum and coexistence that connect such polarities when we reflect about agency and